So as a volunteer in the archive, I've been researching some of the women involved in the early years of the SWRI. And obviously people are familiar with Catherine Blair and all of the work that she did in being a founder member, and also that she was such a prolific letter writer and author and campaigner that there's much more information known about her, and a lot of it is held in the archives at the Balance Trust, which is amazing and has been catalogued just now. But there's also, in the development of the SWRI, there is also so many other women that were involved in doing this work. And I think it was what we wanted to do was to begin to explore who some of these women were that maybe aren't as well known. And it's been a real pleasure to be able to do that. And this information will go to inform the sort of what are called the authority files. So there'll be short bits of information extracted from the work that I've researched to be used for the catalogue. And this will help future researchers to be able to find out who people might be that they're looking for, or to find them more easily, and to make the links that will be sort of developed within the catalogue that I think will be really useful for future researchers. Yeah, I was certainly found it very useful when I was doing the work that I was doing. So it's been some of it's been detective work, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. And one of the first pieces of work I was asked to do was not moving on as I should. Here we go. Was to look at the past presidents of the Scottish Women's Institute. And there is a timeline of all the past presidents from 1917 onwards, but their full names weren't necessarily known, because up until 1970 or the 70s, they were known by their married name and their initial rather than by their first name. And it felt important that their full identity should be known. So that's some of the work that I managed to undertake in finding out who some of these women, what their full names were, that weren't sort of obviously within the archive, and particularly for women early on in that period, wouldn't have had coverage in the press. And some of the detective work was around finding out, going through who their husbands had been, and maybe finding out their first name through their husband's obituary at some point. What's a great resource, as well as the archive, is the local press at that time, because it was so abundant. There were so many local newspapers, and they covered absolutely everything, and particularly with local news. And so it's been a good way of trying to then get dates that I can then go back to the archive, and particularly the magazine Scottish Home and Country, and look for that around the relevant time, and it begins to make it easier to track these down. So we can see, particularly for the last few women, that their initials are their husband's initials, that they're not their first names. So we now have a full record of all the first names of the presidents, which feels important to me to know who these women were and their identities. And the second piece of work from that is to then look at, and this is such an amazing portrait, and there are portraits of all the past presidents in the archive, which is great because so many women wouldn't have had their photograph taken at this time in 1917. And this is of Claire Jessie Tennant Anstruther-Gray, who was born in Australia, in Glenelg. And she was the first president in 1917 to 1933. She was married to Colonel William Anstruther-Gray. He became a Conservative MP for St Andrews, and they had 3 children. And she became one of the first Justice of the Peace, women Justices of the Peace in Scotland, which was really unusual at that time, and obviously involved in gifting the first Cup for Drama in 1930, and awarded a CBE in 1934. So it's this kind of information that will be useful in establishing the authority file for the catalogue. And this is Eva Gooch, who was president between 1933 and 1948, so throughout the Second World War. And she was involved in the early establishment of the SWRI. She was married to Edward Sinclair Gooch, who died in 1915 during the First World War at Gallipoli. But in early 1917, she'd visited one of the first women's institutes in Gloucestershire and was inspired that this could be really work well for some of the more isolated districts in the West Highlands of Scotland, where she was based. And she was a pioneer of the SWRI. She publicly proposed the formation of the institute at a meeting alongside Catherine Blair, held in Edinburgh in 1917. And she continued to be involved in once she'd retired from as president, as in her own federation in Inverness-shire, and also continued to contribute articles to the Scottish Home and Country, particularly about the early history of the SWRI and her role as chairman at that time. It's really quite interesting historical records of her views on how the development of the organisation, which is interesting to have for research purposes, and it's great that this was recorded at that time. So these are the kind of details that will be developed for each of the presidents, and so that we can extract what the archivist believes will be useful to put into the catalogue in a sort of in a consistent form that can then be searched by researchers in the future. And the second part of the work I've been doing recently has been looking at who the staff were, who was employed in the early days to start the development of the SWRI across Scotland. And this has been an interesting exercise to do. These were women, or single women, who were working women who were having a salary. The original salaries were, and payments came from the Department of Agriculture in the Scottish office. And they were, for the first few years, they were important in being able to employ staff to actually go out and try and organise institutes across the whole of Scotland. And Agnes Campbell was the first full-time organiser, was appointed in 1917. And she's interesting in terms of the work that she did. Unfortunately, we haven't yet found a photograph of her. It would be really good to do that, but so far no luck. But prior to working for the SWRI, she had obtained a degree from the University of London, probably in the early 1900s, and that would be highly unusual at that time. Very few women went to university before 1916. University of London was one of the first universities in the UK to admit women. So it's interesting that she was there and had got a degree. We don't know much about her before then. She'd then had gone to spend 3 years in South Africa. And then she worked as a teacher at a girls' school in Jamaica from 1908 to 1910 up in the mountains at Santa Cruz. And also came back and was joint author of The Healthy Girl, which is, you can see on the screen, which was published by Oxford Medical Press in 1916. And I managed to have a look at it at there's a copy in the British Library, so it was really interesting to see her involvement in that and what it was covering. But she was referred to within the archive as being someone that thought it was really important to lay really strong foundations for the movement rather than rapid growth. It was also referred to as writing, developing propaganda work. And this was done by sending out a large number of leaflets, which explained really what the aims and objectives were of the movement, of the WRI. We're currently looking for any of these original leaflets in the archive, but so far haven't found any, and it would be great to find these, because they would really be the sort of first sort of information that had been sent out, really publicising what it was that this movement was that wanted women to join. And she also said that in an article that women's activities should extend beyond the home, as there was a vast amount of work in which their special facilities might be usefully employed. Women's special knowledge and skills could be employed in tackling such national problems as defective housing and ill health among children. So it was really a social sort of concern about the issues that women and children were facing in rural areas at that time. And I quite like this sort of quote at the bottom here about the work that was being done, about the importance of women wanting to come together and do this work. So after 5 years with the SWRI, she returned to the school in Jamaica, this time as a headmistress from, this school, which I managed to find out that she'd had worked at and returned to, is one of the oldest girls' boarding schools in Jamaica, and was founded in 1858. And in an article on their website, there's a short piece about her saying that she maintained the standards of being one of the leading girls' schools in the West Indies. And she was remembered for devoting efforts into the erection of a chapel on the school grounds. And this is a quote from Eva Gooch about her importance in establishing this sort of groundwork for the development of the SWRI across Scotland. And then in a letter to the Scottish Home and Country magazine, which she continued to contribute to even during World War II, she says that she was leaving Jamaica to return to Aberdeen to be involved in a church home for children and homeless. And that's so far what we've been able to find out about her. And this is a wonderful photograph of Nanny Brown, who was the assistant organizer appointed around the same time in 1917. And she continued to work for the SWRI until 1928, when ill health forced her to retire. And she continued to be an honorary advisor and played a leading role in the development of the SWRI across Scotland. Even when she retired, her home continued to be a centre for where it was said that any and every SWRI member could find advice and hospitality. And this is a great photograph again. This is her, a second from the left. She was an active member of the Women's League, Freedom League, which campaigned for women's suffrage, pacifism and equality. And in 1912, she was one of only 6 women who marched from Edinburgh to London. And as they travelled, they were gathering signatures for a petition for women's suffrage. And they were known as the Brown Women, not because of her name, but because they all wore brown clothing. And it took them 5 weeks to carry out the walk. And it was on this march that Catherine Blair first met Nanny Brown. The suffrage marchers were walking to London, went past her farm drive, and she took tea out to them. So she met her then. And then Nanny Brown went to visit her on her farm and came out to speak on political prisoners, and Nanny Brown described her father as the last political prisoner in the New Calton jail for refusing to pay taxes as long as women were not considered persons and didn't have the right to vote. Catherine Blair wrote an obituary for her in the Scotsman. Obituary, I think, spelled out the importance of who she was to her and to the SWRI. And according to one of her obituaries, she is one of the first women who learned to type, and with her sister, among the first women to be seen riding a bike in Scotland. And then this is a photograph we managed to find of Winifred Howard. So she joined as an assistant organizer in 1920, a couple of years after Nanny Brown. And she's seen here in Perthshire. This is from the Scottish Home and Country magazine, instructing Perthshire members on the bottling of fresh fruit. This was 1940, during the Second World War. And she was qualified in domestic science and experienced in child welfare. She'd come up from London in 1919 to work. And she was a member of the Associated Country Women of the World organisation, which was founded in 1929 to bring together rural women and their organisations all over the world. And in doing so, to address the challenges they faced as a result of their isolation of their communities, discrimination against women, and their lack of standing in political processes. And she, in her obituary in the Five Free Press, was really sort of stressed as one of the truly rural and one of the deepest roots of the WRI in Scotland. And I think she died at 95 and was still involved locally in her local WR. Finally, I'm just going to finish off with a little bit about the SWRI demonstration van that was made available through a grant from the government at the beginning of the war, Second World War, to go around Scotland demonstrating the best ways of growing fruit and vegetables and the best ways of cooking and preserving them, because there was a national emergency, as you're probably aware, on ensuring there was enough food for the population, and the best ways of trying to achieve that by growing your own and by using absolutely everything that there was in the best possible ways. And we're trying to identify, you probably can't see in the photograph, but there's two women in this caravan, which is currently, this is a photo outside St Andrew's House in Edinburgh with various sort of dignitaries and government officials. But it was staffed initially by Cynthia Harrison, who is a trained florist, gardener and beekeeper. And Miss Munro, unfortunately, still don't know her first name, was a trained cook and dietitian. She had actually trained at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, which was the first hospital in the UK to have a dietetics department. And she was replaced in 1941 by Lilias Forrest, who's also a dietitian. And the demonstration van started off on its 5 months tour of Scotland at Lark Hall shortly after this. And there's an interesting comment in the Scottish Home and Country where it says that Miss Munro gave a short cookery demonstration which contained an appetizing recipe of stuffed beetroots. It doesn't actually say what they were stuffed with. And this is a van that replaced the initial caravan because of the success of the first tour. There was led to cooperation with the Scottish Gardens and Allotment Committee and the Ministry of Food, and the van toured Scotland throughout the war. And unfortunately, not exactly sure who these two women are, but given it was the time of the year and the month, it's likely that they could be Cynthia Harrison and Lilias Forrest, but can't actually confirm that for sure at the moment. It would be good to be able to do so. And it was considered so successful that others were being organised in England, and the two demonstrators, Cynthia Harrison and Lilias Forrest, were invited down to the north of England to help train the demonstrators that were going to be used in England to go around. And this van travelled across Scotland throughout the war, from Dumfries to Orkney, giving out information on how best to grow your own vegetables and nutrition. And I thought I'd just finish off with this quote from the Pershore Advertiser of that time, which kind of says something about how they were viewed at that time as well. So I'll stop there and see if you've any thoughts or questions you would like to ask. Thank you very much.